Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Geek Nostalgia Podcast. I'm your host, Gene Arona, joined as always by...
What's going on, everybody? I'm Dave. And Gene, I got a question for you.
Yes, sir.
What are you going to do when all these Hulkamaniacs run wild on you, brother?
Oh, we're out, brother. That's awesome. I didn't know you were going to say that. I'm so glad you did. So today's episode, we're getting into Hulk Hogan. And before we get into it, I want to set the table. And I want to do so using a quote from the great Maya Angelou. People will forget what you said. People will forget what you did. People will never forget how you made them feel. So that's relevant to this episode because we're talking about a rather controversial figure. And we're not going to dance around that. Instead, we're just going to talk about what the guy meant to us, how he made us feel. And that's it. That's all I'm going to say on the matter. Dave, want to add to that?
Yeah, we grew up watching Hogan. Big part of our lives all the way through. And whatever negativity other wrestlers say, other people say, go with your version of Hogan, the version that you know. To me, that's probably the best way to approach it.
Yeah.
So my version of Hogan is that classic 80s, say your prayers, eat your vitamins, work out. That's how he will always be to me. Everybody makes mistakes.
I couldn't agree more. Neither of us sitting in this room knew Terry Bollea. We knew Hulk Hogan, the character. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Let's get into that. Dave, you suggested we add this gentleman to the list, and I'm glad you did. I want to give you the honor of starting us off. So take us back. At what point did this larger-than-life character become relevant to you?
Well, he had just started becoming big as the Hulkster, red and yellow. And as a kid, I could remember watching Saturday morning cartoons. And something they did in the 80s was certain cartoon blocks during the commercial breaks, they would let wrestlers come in and do promos. They would even show bits of wrestling matches. This is where I met Hulk Hogan.
I wish I could remember that. I don't, though. Okay. For me, it was slightly different. So my stepdad, Vern, he loved wrestling from the time when he was young. So by, early 90s, 1991, I'm already watching wrestling. I'm already flipping back and forth between what was then WWF and WCW. WWF was the dominant force back then. And so my intro to him was watching him do battle with Randy Macho Man Savage. Later on, some characters like Yokozuna, and we always fought the Giants. We always fought the big guys. He had a couple matches with Undertaker. So that was my intro. And keeping in mind, Dave, as we sit in a room full of geek nostalgia, I love superheroes. Always love superheroes. The wrestlers during this era were larger than life. They were basically, for me, live action superheroes were the closest thing I'd get to it back then. So a guy coming out, big guy. What was Hulk Hogan, like 6'4"?
He was 6'7".
6'7". That's an enormous human being.
6'7" and 23-inch pythons.
He never didn't remind us about those. But he'd come out, he'd be wearing sometimes a big bright red boa thing around his neck. His colors had a whole page dedicated to this, and I'll get into it a little bit later in the conversation. Red and yellow. The way it wasn't just how he was dressed. It was how he talked. Yeah, brother. Very energetic, very aggressively positive. He was the good guy, right? He was the good guy. He was almost like an unstoppable force. And so that energy is what attracted me to him and why it caught my eye from a young age. And frankly, probably one of the big reasons that when my stepdad sat me down to watch wrestling the first handful of times, that I came back for more is because of characters like Hulk.
Yeah, and back then, all those wrestlers, they were big guys. And, the colors, they popped, red and yellow. I think he was the first one to really put those two colors together.
He might have been catching the mustard.
Wow, that's catchy.
Let me piggyback on that with the colors, because like I said, I had a whole page. So there's two things that had to happen for Hulk to become as popular as he did. Okay, first and foremost, Vince, right, the guy who owns and runs WWE, then WWF, he had to make a decision to say, hey, that's going to be my lead horse, right, my lead dog. And he made him everywhere. He put him everywhere all the time, top billings, all the advertisements had Hogan in it. So he was present always. He was ever present in that way. And then you combine that with the fact that he's got the yellow trunks and the red boots, and he just, you can't not see the guy. You can't. And then he starts to talk, and then he has the swagger and all these things about him, right? But then think about the merchandising, right? You can go back to the very first WWE games in 89, 90, something like that. Actually, I got it. 1989, 1991. WWF Superstars and WrestleFest, right? Very pixelated wrestling. You know, you could always recognize in those games Hulk Hogan, big muscle guy, yellow trunks, red everywhere. You can't, even in an era where video games didn't have detail, you could pick out Hulk Hogan, right? And you fast forward, he's in everything. In every way that WWF brands itself, Hogan is present. On top of that loud presence, he's just everywhere. And I know you got some notes on some of the films he was in and some of the other kind of business ventures, but you said it when we were pre-gaming for this show. Even people who didn't watch wrestling knew who Hogan was.
Yeah, a lot of marketing went his way, but you gotta remember he was in wrestling a long time before he got the Hulk Hogan name, and he went through a lot of the areas, because back then it was all different areas in different regions of the country. They'd all have their own little wrestling going on. Plus, he wrestled in Japan. He started off with names like Sterling Golden, Mr. America, Hulk Machine, the Super Destroyer, Hulk Boulder, Terry Boulder. You can't forget his wrestling name in Rocky III, Thunder Lips. But he went through all of these different personas trying to find the it thing. And then, Hulk Hogan, the Hulkster, is the one that took.
Yeah, for good reason. And you're right, I forgot about that era of professional wrestling, and that would have been more in the era of like Vince Sr., when all that consolidation happened from all these smaller wrestling circuits and bringing the best of the best into the WWF. Yeah.
Right. And what really put him over was when he did wrestle the Giant. It was, I think, not the Giant, Andre the Giant. Yeah. Mm-hmm. WrestleMania 1. Andre was in a lot of pain at the time, and it was his time to kind of step out. And back then with Andre, you didn't do anything unless Andre was okay with it, because he would just straight up manhandle you. But he let Hogan get over on him, and that just lifted him up.
I think that started a trend too, by the way, because when you look and you see that Hogan was headlining, it was something like 8 of the 9 first WrestleManias, something like that. He really dominated them. He was always set up as the, no pun intended, the giant killer, right? Because it was Andre, it was King Kong Bundy, it was Sergeant Slaughter, it was Undertaker, Yokozuna, like whoever, like the biggest physical body they could find to put it on.
You can't forget about the Sheik either.
The Sheik, yeah, that was an interesting feud, to say the least.
I mean, with everything that was going on with the world, they turned it into the wrestling.
Oh, yeah. An Iranian-born wrestler around the time when we did, what was it, Desert Storm, I guess, would have been occurring roughly around that time. It was, but that's what he was. He was sort of the big, strong man who came and conquered all the monsters.
Yeah.
So beyond the things that initially put him on your radar, what kept him there for you? Because eventually you get a little bit older. What keeps Hogan relevant for you?
Hogan was always there. I wasn't big on wrestling as a kid. I really didn't understand it. Back when I was watching Saturday morning cartoons, I was just like, who are these monsters? These are big guys, and this one seems to be on here a lot and seems to be like the leader of them all, is how I took it. But I've always, Hogan's always just been in the background, kind of. I've never forgot about him. Other wrestlers come and go, but Hogan's always been there. And to me, he was always, he was like positive too. Even though I've already said it, going back to the say your prayers, take your vitamins, work out. He was influential and was a great sign of America. So
I want you put a pin in that for a second, because you said something I want to jump on. I've already said like a dozen times in this episode how ever present he was. But let's expand on that just for a second. I got some notes here. And movies, I'll let you cover that because I got some notes on there. But you walk into the toy section of, a Kmart back then, back when they still have them, or just your local Walmart, whatever the case may be. There was Hogan toys, right? Vitamins, you mentioned vitamins, clothing. Like, it's outside of traditional sports. There wasn't this level of merchandising available for these athletes. There just wasn't. But for Hogan and the kind of the people that started around his era, that's when you started to see it. Like Hogan action figures, Hogan t-shirts, Hogan. Well, there was eventually a Great American Beer that didn't work out, but
he also had workout programs.
I didn't know that, but I believe it.
Videotapes you could get. And another thing that made him great was he didn't try to push all this stuff on you. He would say, you know what? Go into the fridge, grab a gallon of orange juice, and slowly lift it up and build that bicep. You're still getting a pump. Nobody, especially today, says that. They say, hey, buy this program from me and I'll show you how to do it.
Unfettered positivity. It was hard as a fan not to like. So talk about his film career. And by the way, this is something I think needs to be touched on or highlighted, because when you think about some of the folks that came next, The Rock, right? The Rock, who became a crossover star. He, in a lot of ways, followed the path, obviously much more successfully, that Hogan kind of laid out. So what were some of those early films that you've seen him in that jump out at you?
Roddy Piper was pretty big too.
Fair point.
Very popular. But you can't forget his first role, Rocky III.
Yeah.
Which got him fired from WWF. And then you got No Holds Barred, which introduced Zeus, who was wrestling. And if you can remember, back then with the wrestling, they would try to bring in stars, like celebrities, to make wrestling more popular. So Zeus there, Suburban Commando, Mr. Nanny, those classics. The Thunder in Paradise TV show. You remember ever watching that?
Okay, I don't remember the TV show, but I had the first Thunder in Paradise. I only learned very recently in doing research for this show that there was more than one Thunder in Paradise film.
There's 3 of them.
I watched the first one. I owned the first one on VHS, and I watched it way more than it deserved.
Several other films. You can't forget where he actually played his Hulk character in Gremlins 2. That was a cool part of the movie. And then, like, going back to the celebrity thing.
They did do a lot of celebrity stuff back then. I remember in doing research for this, I seen that Lawrence Taylor headlined one of the WrestleManias or something, or he was a big part of it, which they've continued that trend even on to the day. You see the Paul brothers and stuff involved in wrestling. We've seen Mike Tyson show up over the years.
And WCW seemed to be the one that did that the best.
Dennis Rodman.
I think I remember one night watching it. It was Chuck Norris, Van Damme, and I think it was a famous football player. They were all 3 there, and they all jumped in the ring to have somebody's back. I can't remember who the wrestler was. I don't think it was Hogan, but
I'm gonna look that up.
That kind of stuff was cool, and they did that and just gained more and more attention.
So, moving on from the films and the celebrity stuff, if you're ready, there's a very specific reason that he stayed relevant to me post mid-90s, when otherwise he probably would have kind of disappeared from my radar. And that's video games. This is the other reason why Hogan, even though he's not my favorite wrestler of all time, he's not on my Mount Rushmore of wrestlers, boy, he's so significant to me because, as I mentioned earlier, WrestleFest, some of these games, earlier games, right? When I'd see his red and yellow, that character, I would know, okay, that's a wrestling game, and I want to play that. And it's probably good because it has my characters, regardless if the game was even good or not. I just had characters I knew, right? But then why is he so relevant in the mid-90s to me? Because he goes to WCW, and keep in mind, WCW was a smaller outfit than the WWF. They couldn't really initially compete with them up until the point where they start spending a lot of money bringing these big names over. But the first great WCW game for me wasn't even until like 1997. WCW versus the World / WCW versus NWO New World Order N64 era. Well, that's when Hogan's over, and he's going to NWO and all this other stuff. And now I'm playing with him in a game. I'm dropping leg drops. Excuse me. I'm hitting the big boot to set up the atomic leg drop. I'm playing with him as a character. And if it wasn't for that transition over to WCW, and by the way, I was a huge Sting fan. Huge Sting fan. Like it's almost like he left out of my life and he came back in as a completely kind of different character. And I wasn't a fan, like you said earlier when we were prepping, wasn't a fan of him on the heel turn. But like just like that, he's back in my life, and it's wrestling and it's video games. Two loves of mine, my two biggest loves really back then, wrestling and video games. And then we have that intersection, right, with those two things. And then there's the Monday Night Wars that happened officially, from what I did research on, 95, 2001. So all the years that I was most into wrestling and my formative years for video games, he was there for the journey. You know, whether it was the early WWF games or the WCW games that came on in 64 later, that he was there. He was always present. Whether I liked him or not, with the goofy black beard, I don't know what he was thinking there, coloring his beard. He was there. And so whether I look at him as my favorite wrestler or not, I have certain feelings of nostalgia when I see him, things that I think back to really good times I had either watching wrestling with my stepdad or playing those amazing 4-player wrestling games on 64 with my friends. He was present in both. Love him or hate him, he was present in both. And those are happy memories for me. And really, Dave, I can't think of a better way to sum up his significance to me than that.
Well, Hogan was in the life of wrestling. He was a constant, always there, and he seemed to. Sometimes he would maybe lose a little steam and not be as popular, but he was still always a main guy, whether he had the title or not. But I want to talk about, since you mentioned the video games with NWO, he started out in a band, and then he did the wrestling thing. Mm-hmm. Then he discovered his gimmick, Hulk Hogan, the one that has stayed with him. Good guy, babyface this whole time for years. And then he flips and turns heel. Now, me along with a bunch of other people at that time, that crushed us. We had looked up to this guy because he was so iconic with everything he had done. I mean, you couldn't miss him at all. That's like you said, even if you wasn't a wrestling fan, you know who Hogan was. So for those of us that really knew him from wrestling, that was a huge disappointment. It was a shock. It was crushing. And, you know, I didn't really care for Hogan the whole time that he was Hollywood Hogan. Like, he hurt me that bad doing that. I felt like it was kind of like he gave me the big boot. And it wasn't until, you know, the Wrestling Wars was over and WWE bought WCW. And after a little bit of time, he came back with the red and yellow. He got me back, finally. But that whole time he was Hollywood Hogan, I really didn't care for him.
So, when he was Hollywood Hogan, he was always good on the mic. We both know this. But an interesting thing happened. And that is this. The big muscle-bound wrestlers of the 80s and going into the early 90s were starting to come sort of face-to-face with sort of the newer generation of more what I'll call dynamic wrestlers. You look at Bret Hart, very technical, right? You look at Shawn Michaels, Sting, very athletic. You even look at Undertaker, who himself is another very large man, extremely athletic, right? That was sort of the new generation of wrestlers were, quite frankly, superior athletes. And it really made Hogan stand out because not only was he not a technical wrestler, he wasn't ever actually even a very good wrestler. And his moveset was like a old Mortal Kombat 1 fighter character, like 2-3-ish signature moves, and then there's a finisher. Like, that really started to shine when he was in the Wolfpack, because Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, they were good athletes. Lex Luger, X-Pac, or no, what was he called? Six Pack. I can't remember his name back then, but like these are athletes. He was in a group of athletes, and he kind of stuck out like a sore thumb because and granted, he was older at that time, right? I think when the NWO thing happens, I'd have to go look, but I would imagine he's in his late 40s at that point. So he's not a spring chicken anymore. But on top of not being a spring chicken, he's very simplistic the way he works inside a ring. And it just stopped being quite as exciting. Even playing him as a video game, like his finishing move was literally a leg drop. I'm just saying it. I'm not throwing stones to the guy because I just spent the last 20ish, however many minutes of this podcast we've been talking about him, talking up his significance. But the reality is he was no Dean Malenko. He was not a technical executor inside the ring. He was a character. He put on a show. So I think ultimately NWO thing came along, extended his career, went back to WWF, put on the red and yellow again to kind of leave properly. But it probably all timed out the way it should have in the end.
No, it ended worse than what I thought it should have. But
how so?
Well, before I get to that, so he was in the NWO. They wanted him to turn heel, and they expected him to be the bad guy and for everybody to hate him. He ended up gaining popularity as that. So he overcame being a heel. And it really wasn't until he stopped doing that and went back to the red and yellow, that's when people started booing him and everything. And his last time, I don't remember if it was a WrestleMania or SummerSlam or something, his last event that he attended, he got nothing but boos. So it didn't end too well for him that way. And then that's kind of sad because that was like his last time and they just booed him after everything he's done.
Yeah. Well, so let me ask you this, Dave. During our prep, we mentioned how during that sort of mid-90s, getting into the Attitude Era, where anti-heroes like Stone Cold or when The Rock came around, he was very mouthy, right? Openly insulting people, but the fans loved him. That was why Surfer Sting became the Crow. That was the impetus for Hogan turning to Hollywood Hogan, because it was a response to where the fans head toward the kind of characters they're into at that point in time. Granted, this is the mid-90s, we're coming off the grunge era of music and all these other things, Fight the Man, all that stuff. So I understand why he went to heel turn, but I guess in me pointing that out, and I'm only thinking about this right now, Dave, the question to you is, as someone who's arguably a much bigger Hogan fan even than I, should he have retired with the Hollywood Hogan shtick? You said it raised popularity anyway. Was that the best time for him to go out versus digging up an old shtick that actually technically had lost popularity years before?
Well, I believe he was supposed to go out as Hollywood Hogan because he wrestled The Rock. And I think that was his last match. I'm not sure if when he came back as a red and yellow, if he wrestled any after that. But he let The Rock get over on him. And that's passing the torch. That's probably when he should have retired.
Okay. That makes sense. Well, do you have anything else to add on Mr. Hulk Hogan?
I will say one thing Hogan did do, because he didn't have too many wrestling skills. That was flashy anyway. It was always something when he'd get beat down, and it's kind of what he was known for. Getting beat down, and then all of a sudden you hit him, and oh no, he can't feel that.
When he hulked up.
Hit him again, no, and then he starts shaking his head, and then stands up, and then he points. That was an incredible feeling. So what we need to keep in mind is Hulk Hogan, he's not WWF, he's not WCW, he's just wrestling. He was an iconic character, and he was for decades. He had a really long career. Whatever he did in his personal life, that's his personal life.
Yeah.
But that's how I know him, and that's how I choose to remember him.
And same here. Yeah. I'm right there with you. I choose to remember him as the almost superhero-esque character that I've seen on TV. And that's good enough for me. So with that, we'll go ahead and shut this down. Thank you for tuning in to another episode. Catch you next time.
Peace out, y'all.
See ya.